to borrow a phrase from my friend Professor Prabhat Patnaik, the moral universe of the media has shifted, and shifted significantly. Something very fundamental has changed. It's changed in the country and has to change in the media as well. It's changed in the country. If you're looking at the agrarian crisis, consider one point about the agrarian crisis, the largest we've had in 50 years. Consider this. In the 1960s and 70s, we had mass peasant struggles. We had battles for land reform that resulted in the distribution of millions of acres of land over time. We had mass peasant struggles in the 1960s and 70s. In the 1990s and 2000s, you have mass peasant suicides. Something fundamental has changed about how India thinks. Something fundamental has shifted about how this country and how this society functions. Why did mass protests, mass struggles give way to mass suicides in the largest section of our population? Any sphere you look at, inequality. Any sphere you look at, hyper-commercialization, predatory commercialization. In this setup is where paid news has to emerge. There is no choice but for paid news to emerge. Okay? Paid news is not an aberration. It's obnoxious. That's a different thing. Paid news did not come out of a hole in the ground. Of course there's a prehistory to it. Of course there's a long process preceding it. Of course there are many things, including in this decade, MediaNet, private treaties, all these things that preceded it. But what's happening in the current phase has very clear lineage. Now, the second question about paid news, is it journalistic corruption or is it, what is it? A recent discussion in this city at which some of you were present framed it as if it was journalistic. Why do journalists surrender whatever space in return for quotes and buts? That's absolutely fraudulent. It is pinning on the journalist something that he has very little to do with. Journalistic corruption is as old as journalism. That's another question altogether. Paid news in this form is structured extortion by the media companies. The first complaint of paid news by a big politician, a then Union Minister of State, now a member of the Press Council, was in Nagpur when he stopped Jaideep Ardikar of DNA and me and said, I really have to talk to you. It's also my profession. He was also a journalist. So he said, they asked me, these guys asked me 20 lakhs to cover my constituency. We wrote the story. That was coverage packages and credibility discounts. That was the first of the Hindu series. Paid news worked for politicians because in elections it worked. It's not only about elections. In elections it worked because the politician could break the election spending limit many times over. It worked for the newspaper because it's a purely cash transaction and therefore doesn't go on to the record books and you don't pay taxes on it. But I want to, while this depressing situation exists where the Press Council has sold itself out to the treasures of management, one, I will say that's a fantastic report, read it. Two, I will say there were some very wonderful things during this entire racket of paid news. How did I get all those pages? How did I get all those stories? How did we get all those data? I didn't step outside to get them after the first two stories. My house was flooded with 32 kgs of paid news packets from young journalists all across Maharashtra. The media are now too embedded in every other sector for you to treat them as an exclusive entity. They have to be treated as any other corporate entity. When they are a corporate business entity, they have to follow the laws that apply to other corporate business entities. Okay? And you're going to need a whole raft of new legislation, anti-monopoly, anti-corporate legislation. Without it, you're going to make changes that will be transient and that will slide back.